Hello, and welcome to the Pragmatic American Podcast. Before we jump into today's episode, please subscribe to the channel. And if you find this content compelling, take a moment to like, share, and leave a comment. All of that really helps, and I genuinely appreciate the support. I've learned over time that something is probably a big deal when a wide range of serious people, from demographers to economists to technologists, all start issuing the same warning independently. And yet it barely registers in mainstream media. That's usually a signal that the issue is real, cuts across ideology, threatens existing assumptions, or simply doesn't fit neatly into the political narratives of the day. And the birth gap is one of those issues. The birth gap, or fertility gap, is simply the difference between how many children a society needs to replace itself, about 2.1 per person, and how many children are actually being born. In the United States, that number is closer to 1.6. When a society stays below replacement, generation after generation, as we have for some time now, it doesn't sustain itself. It slowly declines and eventually quite literally dies. But wait, you might be asking yourself, why aren't they talking about this on Fox or CNN or whatever MSNBC is calling itself today? Why isn't this treated like the big deal it clearly is? The truth is that many prominent voices have been raising the alarm for years. Demographers like Philip Longman warned years ago that falling birth rates threaten long-term prosperity. Researchers like Paul Moreland, who've documented how sustained low fertility reshapes nations, economies, and cultures over time. Figures like Yifuxian, who have gone so far as to argue that population decline poses a greater risk than war or recession. Eventually, those warnings began coming from beyond academia. Geopolitical analysts like Ian Bremmer, who frames demographic collapse as one of the defining global risks of this century, something that quietly undermines everything from economic growth to political stability. And finally, when someone with enormous cultural reach, like Elon Musk, starts repeatedly warning that population collapse is one of the biggest threats facing civilization, it becomes hard to argue this is fringe, partisan, or theoretical. And yet, despite all of that, the conversation barely breaks through into the everyday discourse of Americans. Not because the data isn't there, or because we aren't already seeing the impacts, we are, but because the implications are uncomfortable and, predictably, political. Because the birth gap doesn't just challenge policy or ideology, it challenges the stories we tell ourselves about progress, autonomy, and what a successful society looks like, and what the future may actually hold. The next question is, what does the birth gap actually mean? When a society falls below replacement for long enough, the consequences don't arrive all at once. They unfold slowly, and then all at once. The first thing that changes is the age structure. The population gets older. There are more retirees, and fewer young adults coming up behind them. Sound familiar? That shift alone begins to ripple through everything else. As the population ages, the workforce shrinks. Fewer people are available to do the work that keeps the economy moving. Not just high-skilled jobs, but essential everyday work that can't simply disappear. With fewer workers comes a smaller tax base. Fewer taxpayers are supporting more dependents, and that imbalance puts real pressure on public systems that were designed for a growing or stable population. Retirement savings and pension programs begin to strain. Healthcare systems feel the pressure. Systems that depend on a steady inflow of younger contributors start to wobble, partly because most are poorly designed, but largely because the underlying math no longer works. And over time, something harder to quantify begins to erode: cultural and institutional continuity. Fewer people are left to carry traditions forward, to staff institutions, to pass on knowledge, norms, and civic habits. Demographic decline doesn't announce itself as a crisis. It shows up as exhaustion, economic, institutional, and cultural. At this point in the conversation, someone usually offers what sounds like a reasonable objection. AI and automation will solve this. And to be fair, there's truth there. Automation does reduce the need for labor. Productivity per worker can increase. We already see it. Self-checkout lanes at the grocery store, automated warehouses, AI assistants handling tasks that used to require people. At a narrow economic level, that argument makes sense. But here's the problem. AI replaces tasks. It does not replace generations. Even in a highly automated society, the basic demographic math doesn't disappear. Dependency ratios still worsen as populations age. Healthcare and caregiving still require human beings, especially as the elderly population grows. And economies still depend on consumers, people who form households, raise families, and create demand. Innovation itself tends to slow in aging societies. Older populations are generally more cautious, more risk-averse, and more focused on preserving what exists than on building what comes next. Automation can increase efficiency, but it can't manufacture culture, and it cannot produce generational renewal. Seen in that light, automation isn't a solution to the birth gap. It's a coping mechanism. It's a response to scarcity. It's a symptom, not a cure. Automation can replace labor. It cannot replace lineage. Automation isn't proof that the birth gap doesn't matter. It's often a response to labor scarcity. When fewer young workers are available, industries compensate, not just to cut costs, but to fill gaps. AI may delay some of the consequences of demographic decline, but it does not reverse it. To understand how we got here, we need to be clear about one thing. This wasn't one decision or one policy. It was a sequence, policies and cultural movements that have been unfolding since the early 20th century. And that sequence has a starting point in American history that's uncomfortable, but real. The first organized framework in the United States that treated fewer births as a form of progress was eugenics. In the early 20th century, eugenics was embraced by academics, policymakers, and social reformers, who believed society could be improved by controlling who reproduced and who didn't. The idea wasn't fringe, it was mainstream. States passed forced sterilization laws. Tens of thousands of people were sterilized against their will, a practice upheld by the Supreme Court. At its core, eugenics introduced a dangerous idea into public policy: that human reproduction was not inherently good, but something to be managed, limited, or reduced in the name of progress. Eventually, eugenics was rejected, rightly, for being immoral, discriminatory, and inhumane. But here's the part that matters for this conversation. We rejected eugenics for how it controlled reproduction, not for the broader belief that reproduction should be controlled and regulated. After World War II, eugenics became morally radioactive. The Nazi regime's use of racial science to justify sterilization, euthanasia, and ultimately genocide exposed where those ideas could lead. The horrors associated with it made both the language and the methods indefensible. But the underlying direction didn't entirely disappear. What changed was the language. Birth control and population reduction were no longer discussed in terms of coercion or social engineering. They were reframed, carefully, as matters of personal autonomy, healthcare, and compassion. The emphasis shifted from what society wanted to prevent to what individuals were encouraged to choose. Reproduction was no longer something to be restricted by force, but something to be discouraged quietly, framed as optional or burdensome. The goal remained largely the same. The method became softer. The moral weight was redistributed, away from society, onto the individual. Very few things in this country have become more normalized than abortion. Originally, it was framed as rare, tragic, and undesirable. Over time, that framing changed. Abortion became normalized, routinized, and oddly celebrated in some circles. Described less as a moral tragedy and more as a standard medical procedure, a routine aspect of reproductive health care, a woman's right. As that shift occurred, birth itself quietly lost moral priority. Carrying a child was no longer assumed to be the default outcome. It became one option among many, and often the least supported one. There is also a racial reality that cannot be ignored if this conversation is going to be honest. Abortion rates in the United States are disproportionately high in Black communities. That fact exists regardless of anyone's intent, and regardless of how the policy is framed. Figures like Margaret Sanger loom large in this history, not because they explain everything, but because they illustrate how early birth control advocacy often intersected with population control and eugenic thinking, particularly when it came to the poor and minority populations. The long-term result of these dynamics is demographic contraction. Fewer births, fewer families, and fewer future generations in the very communities already facing the greatest social and economic pressure. Intentions aside, outcomes matter. At some point, consistent outcomes stop being neutral. Alongside that shift, something deeper was happening culturally. Sex was gradually detached from the structures that once gave it weight and consequence. It was separated from marriage, from permanence, from obligation, and eventually from reproduction itself. In that framework, children were no longer understood as the natural outcome of adulthood or intimacy. They were reframed, first as a planning failure, then as a logistical burden. Over time, the message hardened. Children were something that complicated lives, disrupted careers, limited independence, and stood in the way of broader social goals, especially for women. Motherhood, once treated as a cornerstone of adulthood, was increasingly framed as a trade-off, something to be delayed, managed, or avoided altogether in the name of autonomy and self-actualization. When sex is disconnected from responsibility, and responsibility is disconnected from meaning, reproduction stops being a shared expectation. It becomes optional, and optional things are the first to disappear under pressure. At this point, it's important to be clear about what this is and what it is not. This is not a moral judgment of people. It's an analysis of dominant cultural narratives and their demographic effects. Same-sex relationships, by definition, are non-reproductive. That fact isn't a criticism, it's simply biology. The demographic issue emerges when a culture treats all relationship models as equally foundational to society, while quietly removing reproduction from the center of what family means. When reproduction is no longer central, when continuity becomes optional rather than expected, birth rates fall, and they fall everywhere this shift occurs. This isn't unique to one country, one religion, or one political system. It's a universal pattern. A culture can affirm individual identities and still face demographic consequences if it no longer places reproduction at the core of social meaning. And when that happens, culture alone can't do the work of replacing itself. A society that centers non-reproductive identities cannot rely on culture alone to reproduce itself. Taken one at a time, each of these shifts is usually defended on its own terms. Each policy is justified individually. Each change is framed as progress, compassion, freedom, or care for those facing difficult circumstances. And when viewed in isolation, many of those arguments sound reasonable. But culture isn't shaped in isolation. It's shaped cumulatively. And when you step back and look at the combined effect, a pattern emerges. Births decline. Adulthood is delayed. Families grow weaker, more fragile, and less central to social life. Responsibility is postponed. Commitment is treated as negotiable, and continuity becomes optional rather than expected. This didn't require hostility toward children. It didn't require malice or cruelty. None of this required hating children. It only required treating them as optional. When societies confront sustained birth decline, immigration is often presented as the solution. And to be clear, immigration does play an important role. Legal immigration, of course. In the short term, legal immigration can stabilize population numbers. It adds working-age adults to the economy. It helps fill labor gaps, and for a time, it buys breathing room. But immigration is a stopgap, not a replacement for reproduction. What legal immigration does not do is restore replacement-level fertility. It does not prevent long-term population aging, and it does not replace native family formation over time. There's a simple reason for that. Immigrant fertility rates tend to converge downward within 1 or 2 generations. As immigrant families assimilate, their birth patterns begin to mirror those of the host society. In other words, immigration can delay consequences, but it does not solve the underlying problem. If the culture itself is not reproducing, importing people only postpones the reckoning. This leads to the part of the immigration conversation that's often avoided. Immigration only works if assimilation works. Historically, successful immigration has always depended on a clear expectation. Newcomers join an existing civic culture. That requires a society confident enough to assert its own norms, not aggressively, but unapologetically. At a minimum, one legal system must govern. Shared laws and shared expectations allow diverse populations to function as a single society. When assimilation weakens, parallel societies begin to form, separate norms, separate loyalties, and sometimes separate ideas of authority. Those parallel systems aren't just culturally different, they're destabilizing. They erode social trust, strain institutions, and make governance harder. Immigration can strengthen a nation, but only when it's paired with assimilation and cultural confidence. A society that refuses to reproduce itself and refuses to assimilate newcomers has already chosen replacement. At this point, the obvious response is simple: have more babies. But let's be honest, that's a little bit easier said than done, let alone mandated or made part of policy. You can't command people to have children. You can't guilt them into it. And you can't subsidize births into existence with tax credits and incentives alone. Those approaches may help at the margins, but they don't address the core issue, because birth behavior doesn't respond primarily to policy. It responds to meaning. People have children when it makes sense within a moral framework, when family is treated as foundational, when sacrifice is understood as worthwhile, when adulthood carries expectations, not just options. In societies where those structures weaken, reproduction doesn't stop overnight. It slowly fades. Because when meaning erodes, so do commitments. And when commitment becomes optional, birth follows it out the door. At this point, it's worth looking honestly at who is still having children and why. Across countries and cultures, the pattern is remarkably consistent. The groups that continue to sustain higher birth rates are overwhelmingly religious. Christians, Catholic, Orthodox, and Evangelical, observant Jews and Muslims. This isn't about wealth, education, or access to birth control. In many cases, these communities face more economic pressure, not less. What they share is something deeper. In religious cultures, children are seen as blessings, not obstacles. Sacrifice has meaning beyond personal fulfillment. Family is treated as normative rather than optional. And continuity, the idea that life extends beyond the individual, is expected. Those beliefs don't just encourage birth, they normalize it. By contrast, highly secular individualist cultures consistently struggle to sustain fertility over time. Not because people are selfish or malicious, but because the framework they live within offers no compelling reason to sacrifice for a future they're not anchored to, which leads to an uncomfortable but observable conclusion. Secular individualism has no internal mechanism to sustain fertility. So what's the answer? It isn't one thing, it has to be both. First, a serious society has to encourage birth, not through slogans or coercion, but by removing the penalties that make family formation fragile. That means restoring the moral legitimacy of parenthood, treating marriage and children not as lifestyle accessories but as foundational institutions, and acknowledging, honestly, that the Christian moral foundations this country was built on helped create a culture where family, sacrifice, and continuity made sense, without imposing belief and without coercion. Culture matters. Meaning matters. People don't have children because they're told to. They do it because it fits into a life that feels coherent and worth extending. Second, immigration has to be handled carefully and intentionally. That means being selective, expecting assimilation, insisting on one legal system and shared civic norms, and treating newcomers not as disposable labor units, but as future citizens who are joining an existing society, not replacing it. Immigration can strengthen a nation, but only when it's paired with cultural confidence and continuity. In the end, this doesn't require panic or paranoia. We don't need a conspiracy to explain the birth gap. We only need a society that mistook autonomy for meaning, progress for permanence, and efficiency for survival. Thanks for watching. These aren't easy conversations. They're not designed to be comfortable, but they matter because the future is shaped long before we feel its consequences. If this episode made you think, I'd ask you to do a few simple things. Like it, subscribe, leave a comment, even if you disagree, and share it with someone who should be part of this conversation. The birth gap isn't a partisan issue, it's a generational one. And the more honest conversations we have now, the better prepared we'll be for what comes next. Thanks again. Until the next time.